So Princess Anne just did something that 3 decades of royal journalism, parliamentary inquiries, and multi-million-pound documentary productions completely failed to do. She confirmed the existence of a letter that Princess Diana wrote in the final weeks of her life. A letter so specific, so legally precise, and so deliberately preserved that it doesn't just rewrite the history of one broken marriage. It potentially ends the carefully constructed future of the woman who replaced Diana in that marriage. And the way this is all unraveling right now tells you everything you need to know about how fragile Camilla's position actually is. Because here's what nobody is saying out loud yet. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a grieving brother stumbling across old paperwork in a dusty archive. Charles Spencer spent 48 hours working with a forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives before he said a single word publicly. He compared handwriting pressure points against hundreds of verified letters in the Spencer family repository. He had the paper authenticated against the Kensington Palace letterhead. He confirmed the date in the corner, August 10, 1997, 21 days before the crash in Paris. And only then, only after every legal and forensic box had been ticked, did he make a single phone call. Not to the palace, not to a press contact. To Anne. And the fact that Anne picked up that phone, listened to what her brother-in-law had found, and gave her quiet endorsement tells you that she had been waiting for exactly this moment. The letter itself is unlike anything that has ever emerged from within the walls of the Windsor institution. Diana wasn't writing emotionally. She wasn't venting frustration to a sympathetic family member, the way her private recordings had sometimes suggested. This letter reads like a legal document, like something prepared in consultation with a solicitor who understood exactly what language would need to survive scrutiny decades later. She used phrases like administrative trap. She referenced specific clauses in the 1772 Royal Marriages Act. She named the legal mechanisms being assembled against her with the kind of precision that doesn't come from paranoia. It comes from access to actual documentation. And she had that access because, 2 days before she wrote this letter, she had obtained an internal palace document outlining a coordinated plan to reduce her security detail as leverage to force her out of independent media work. That's not a woman who was falling apart. That's a woman who had identified the enemy, mapped their strategy, and decided to create a paper trail. But here's the part of this story that connects directly to Camilla. Because Diana didn't write that letter in isolation. She didn't send it to a friend or a therapist or a journalist. She sent it to Anne. And the reason she sent it to Anne, the reason she specifically chose Anne out of every person in her life at that moment, is documented in the letter itself. She wrote that Anne was the only member of the Windsor family with the courage to look a reigning monarch in the eye and defend a mother's basic human rights. That's an extraordinary sentence. But read it again slowly, and you start to understand what Diana was actually communicating. She wasn't just praising Anne's personal courage, she was drawing a line inside the Windsor family between the people willing to protect her and the people working against her. And Camilla is on the wrong side of that line. Now, nothing in the letter mentions Camilla by name. That matters. Because the absence of Camilla's name in a document this specific and this legally precise is itself a statement. Diana knew how to document. She knew how to name names when she wanted a record to exist. The fact that she chose Anne as her ally and structured the entire letter around the institutional machinery working against her without ever referencing the woman who had been at the center of her marriage's destruction suggests that by August 1997, Diana had elevated her understanding of the situation far beyond the personal. She wasn't writing about a love triangle anymore. She was documenting a state apparatus. And the state apparatus, as she understood it, was using the cover of institutional stability to protect an arrangement that served one person above all others. The woman who was already being quietly positioned as Charles's future. The detail about the 1772 Royal Marriages Act is the one that should concern Camilla's advisors most. Diana wrote that the ultimate goal of the administrative maneuvering around her security and her media access was to create conditions for a custody dispute over William and Harry. And not a conventional family court dispute, a constitutional one. She wrote that the plan involved invoking an ancient clause that asserted the sovereign's right to determine where the children of the blood royal lived, where they attended school, and how their daily lives were structured. She called this the assembly of legal machinery, and she documented it not as speculation, but as something she had seen in writing 2 days earlier. If that machinery was being assembled in August 1997 to reduce Diana's ability to operate independently, the beneficiary of that machinery wasn't abstract. Somebody was going to fill the space Diana was being pushed out of. And in the summer of 1997, there was only one candidate. Anne understood this, and the administrative logs that are now being cross-referenced with the letter's contents prove that she understood it in real time, not retrospectively. Between 1996 and 1997, Anne's charitable schedules placed her in the same regional sectors as Diana's private humanitarian visits on multiple occasions. Their cars were logged at identical service depots near the M4 motorway within 30 minutes of each other on 3 separate dates. The official explanation at the time would have been coincidence, diary clashes, overlapping regional commitments from 2 senior royals with busy schedules. But the letter makes clear that those meetings weren't coincidences. Anne was providing Diana with tactical updates on the legal strategies being developed by the king's solicitors. She was running an intelligence operation inside the institution she had served her entire life, and she was doing it specifically because she had seen what was coming and had decided, quietly and without any public declaration, which side she was on. The summer of 1996 gives you the most revealing single moment in this entire story. During a private family dinner at Balmoral Castle, a senior advisor to the Queen suggested using ancient Crown property statutes to restrict Diana's access to her apartments at Kensington Palace. The proposal was to force her to relocate her office outside London, cutting off her proximity to the media infrastructure that gave her independence and public reach. It was dressed up in administrative language, property management, logistical efficiency, the kind of institutional framing that makes a punitive action sound like housekeeping. Anne sat through the presentation and then interrupted it. She called it an act of absolute corporate stupidity that would permanently damage the Crown's public standing. The proposal was killed before it could be drafted into an official warrant. Now think about who benefits when Diana's media access is reduced. Think about who benefits when Diana is moved away from London, away from the press contacts, away from the public platform that had made her the most recognized woman on the planet. Think about who benefits when the public narrative is shaped by palace communications rather than by Diana's own independent voice and presence. The name writes itself. And Anne looked across that dinner table at Balmoral in the summer of 1996 and made a decision that would define the next 30 years of her life. She was going to stand between Diana and the machinery that was trying to erase her. Not loudly, not publicly, but absolutely. Diana found out about the confrontation the next morning through a secure telephone connection provided by Anne's lady-in-waiting. That's the detail that lands hardest when you sit with it for a moment. Anne didn't call Diana herself. She didn't send a message through a mutual contact or a trusted staff member in the conventional sense. She used a secure line specifically to prevent interception, because by that point, both women understood that their communication was being monitored. The palace machinery that was assembling legal frameworks against Diana's custody rights and her residential access was sophisticated enough that they were taking precautions against it. And Anne, the Princess Royal, daughter of Queen Elizabeth, one of the hardest-working senior royals in the history of the modern monarchy, was running what amounted to a counterintelligence operation inside her own family's institution. The reason this demolishes Camilla's position isn't just historical, it's structural. Because Camilla's legitimacy as queen consort has always rested on a specific narrative. The narrative that the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage was a private and mutual tragedy, that both parties bore responsibility, that the complications of the marriage preceded and were separate from Charles's relationship with Camilla. The palace spent enormous resources over many years constructing and maintaining that narrative. The rehabilitation of Camilla, from the woman the British public blamed for Diana's unhappiness into a respected, beloved queen consort, represents one of the most sustained and expensive public relations operations in the history of the monarchy. And it was built entirely on the foundation of that narrative. Diana's letter doesn't just complicate that narrative. It describes the institutional infrastructure that was actively working to accelerate Diana's removal from the picture. It documents specific legal mechanisms. It identifies specific administrative strategies. It timestamps them to August 1997, and it makes absolutely clear that the person Diana trusted most inside the institution, The one Windsor she identified as possessing moral courage unconnected to public approval was operating in direct opposition to the machinery driving that removal. If the machinery was working to remove Diana, and the machinery was simultaneously protecting the institution's future in the form of the relationship that would eventually produce the current queen consort, then the rehabilitation narrative doesn't survive contact with the letter's contents. Because the letter proves that the removal wasn't just a private marital tragedy, it was an administered process, and administered processes have administrators, and those administrators were serving someone's interests. William's response to all of this is the part that should worry Clarence House most acutely. When the king's advisors approached him about signing a joint family statement acknowledging the letter's historical value while framing it as a reflection of a bygone era of court tension, William rejected the script completely. He spent 20 minutes on the phone with his father's private secretary, declining to authorize his staff to participate in any campaign designed to minimize or spin his mother's original words. He said the letter was an authentic piece of his family history, and that he fully respected the absolute non-disclosure that his Aunt Anne had maintained for 30 years to protect his childhood. That's a public prince, choosing his mother's documented account of institutional maneuvering over his father's communications strategy. That's a future king declining to provide cover for the current king's public relations apparatus. And by refusing to back the defensive strategy, William effectively isolated the palace machine and left it exposed to full public scrutiny at the moment of maximum media intensity. That isolation matters enormously for Camilla, because William's relationship with his stepmother has always been the crucial variable in the long-term viability of her position. The palace has worked extremely hard to project an image of familial acceptance and warmth between William, Kate, and the current king and queen. State appearances have been choreographed to suggest unity. Formal photographs have been designed to communicate stability. But underneath those carefully managed public moments, the private reality has always been more complicated. And William's refusal to back the defensive strategy in the aftermath of the letter's release suggests that when the institutional pressure becomes acute enough, when the choice between protecting his mother's documented truth and protecting his father's communications narrative becomes unavoidable, he chooses his mother. Every time. The public response outside Buckingham Palace told the same story in emotional terms that the administrative logs tell in documentary ones. Thousands of people stood in silence, holding evening editions of newspapers, featuring full-page replicas of Diana's sloping handwriting. Opinion polls showed over 80% of citizens praising Anne for carrying the emotional burden in silence, and over 90% expressing gratitude for Anne's protection of the young princes. Those numbers are devastating for Camilla's position, because they reveal the size of the gap between the public rehabilitation narrative that the palace has been constructing for decades and the public's actual underlying emotional relationship with Diana's memory. You cannot have 90% of respondents expressing gratitude for the protection of the young princes without implicitly acknowledging that those young princes needed protection. And if they needed protection, they needed it from something. And the letter tells you very precisely what that something was. The communications collapse inside the palace when the letter became public was immediate and total. Over 300 administrative computers within the palace network simultaneously accessed the high-resolution scans uploaded from the Althorp press server. Senior media directors abandoned their morning routines to crowd around monitoring walls watching BBC and Sky News broadcast continuous live coverage. The front pages across every major publication featured large black typography analyzing the phrase "administrative trap" that Diana had written 33 years earlier. The king's advisors started calculating strategic damage immediately, and then came the operational crisis that revealed exactly how unprepared they were for the scale of what had just happened. They had been scheduled to launch a major media campaign on Friday morning promoting Queen Camilla's upcoming state charity appearances in London. Fashion coverage, lifestyle updates, the kind of soft power image management that the Palace Communications Department executes routinely as part of the ongoing work of cementing Camilla's public identity as a warm, engaged, working queen consort. The media directors looked at their launch schedule, looked at the front pages, and realized within minutes that proceeding with promotional content about Camilla while the public was reading about Diana's final desperate warning to Anne about the institutional machinery assembling against her would be catastrophic. The king's chief secretary froze the entire promotional schedule and locked the media assets back in the archive safe. The campaign that had been months in preparation was abandoned in a single morning. That abandoned campaign is a small thing in isolation, but it's a precise illustration of the structural problem that the letter has created for Camilla's position going forward. Every piece of positive coverage about Camilla's role now exists in competition with the letter's documented account of the administrative machinery that served the interests of her position. The palace cannot simultaneously promote Camilla as the beloved queen consort and suppress public engagement with Diana's documented account of the institutional forces that were at work in the period leading up to her death. The public is not going to hold those two narratives in comfortable parallel. People are going to choose which one they believe, and the letter, forensically authenticated, physically preserved, legally registered at the London High Court Probate Registry, is a significantly more credible document than a palace communication strategy drafted by advisors whose primary skill is narrative management. Anne's role in all of this emerges as something that requires a complete reassessment of everything the public thought they knew about her. For 30 years, the media maintained a specific and consistent image of Anne: efficient, unsentimental, professionally committed to her charitable work, occasionally abrasive, fundamentally cold toward the drama and emotional complexity that Diana represented. The media portrayed Anne as someone who viewed Diana with a mixture of impatience and mild contempt, the serious working royal versus the celebrity who had turned her personal anguish into a global brand. That portrait was so persistent and so consistent across so many different media outlets and so many different decades that it came to feel like established fact. Biographers cited it. Documentary producers built narratives around it. Former palace staff confirmed it in tell-all books. The cold, efficient Anne versus the warm, suffering Diana became one of the defining contrasts of the modern monarchy's most turbulent period, and it was completely, deliberately, strategically false. Anne maintained that false impression for 30 years as a protective operation, because if the press believed she and Diana were rivals, nobody would think to look for communication between them. Nobody would investigate shared calendar entries near M4 service depots. Nobody would ask questions about secure telephone connections facilitated by ladies-in-waiting. The public image of Anne's cold disdain for Diana was the cover that allowed the actual alliance to function undetected, and Anne sustained that cover through 3 decades of intense media scrutiny, through every wave of public Diana obsession, through every documentary crew seeking comment, through every palace audit of private correspondence, without ever once breaking. When the palace archivists requested a comprehensive audit of her private correspondence files ahead of the king's Jubilee events, she rejected the request instantly. She told them her safe contained personal family correspondence entirely separate from the state's administrative workflow and refused to hand over the keys. The palace legal department realized they had no grounds to force a daughter of Queen Elizabeth to surrender her private papers without creating a damaging internal court battle. So the letter stayed locked away. The cover held. Anne kept her word. And while she was keeping that word, while the fireproof safe at Gatcombe Park held the duplicate copy beneath equestrian breeding logs and family land titles, the palace was spending those same 30 years building Camilla's rehabilitation. It's worth holding those two facts alongside each other for a moment. For 30 years, Anne preserved Diana's documented account of the institutional machinery working against her. For those same 30 years, the palace machinery was systematically repositioning the woman that machinery had served to make room for. The rehabilitation required enormous resources. It required strategic placement of sympathetic media coverage. It required the gradual introduction of Camilla into formal public life at carefully calibrated intervals. It required the management of William and Harry's public posture toward their stepmother. It required the projection of Charles as a man who had found eventual happiness after a mutually tragic marriage, rather than as a man whose parallel relationship had been actively protected by the institutional infrastructure while his wife was being administratively isolated. The rehabilitation narrative required all of this to remain uncontested. And for 30 years, it did remain uncontested, because the letter was locked in a safe. Now the letter is in the National Archive, permanently registered, beyond reach of palace censorship or modification. The administrative verification was officially stamped at the London High Court Probate Registry. Diana's words are now part of the public record in a way that cannot be altered, suppressed, or managed. And the rehabilitation narrative that Camilla's position depends on now has to compete with that public record every single day for the rest of the current reign and potentially beyond. The detail about the second copy of the letter adds another dimension that the palace's legal team is still working through. There's a duplicate sitting in a law firm vault in Fleet Street, sealed in a lead-lined container, registered under an anonymous corporate holding company 30 years ago. The palace legal team apparently tried to find grounds to block publication of the original, but couldn't. The letter was addressed to a private individual, not a state official. It was found in the private archives of Althorpe House. The Crown has zero constitutional authority over it. But the existence of that lead-line duplicate in an anonymous corporate vault suggests that Diana, and whoever helped her with the legal architecture of this document, were anticipating exactly the kind of institutional response that eventually came. They built redundancy into the preservation strategy. They made it impossible for a single seizure or a single decision to suppress the document entirely. That's not the behavior of a woman operating emotionally and reactively. That's the behavior of a woman who understood institutional power well enough to construct a legal framework that it couldn't dismantle. And then there's the repository. Diana referenced in the letter a secret personal collection containing over 200 original letters and diary entries from her school days and her early marriage. She wrote that she had hidden this repository entirely outside the palace infrastructure, completely separate from the royal archives at Windsor Castle. And she instructed her personal trustees to release the entire archive to the public if the central administration ever attempted to completely block her access to her sons following the upcoming autumn term. That condition, written in August 1997, tied the release of 200 additional documents to an institutional action. The king's advisors are reportedly working to track the movement of old Spencer family holdings from that era, trying to locate the repository before any further disclosures can happen. Which means there's a live operational situation right now where the palace is actively searching for a cache of Diana's private documents that may or may not have already been transferred to a location they cannot access. And every document in that repository, if it exists and if it surfaces, will be read through the lens of the letter that's already in the National Archive. The postscript at the bottom of the letter is the detail that lands most heavily when you sit with the full picture of everything this document represents. She wrote that she was leaving for the Mediterranean the following morning with a deep sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that her time to secure her son's emotional safety was rapidly running out. That line, written 3 weeks before her death, transforms the document from a piece of family correspondence into something much harder to categorize. It's a time-stamped record of a woman who in the final weeks of her life was fighting a sophisticated institutional battle and who understood, with a clarity that's almost unbearable to read 30 years later, that she was running out of time to win it. She chose Anne as the person she trusted most to carry the weight of what she knew. She wrote the letter, had the duplicate registered in a lead-lined container in Fleet Street, hid 200 additional documents in a location outside the palace's reach, and then left for the Mediterranean. 3 weeks later, she was gone. For Camilla, the accumulated weight of all these details creates a problem that no amount of communications management can solve. Because the problem isn't a single damaging story that can be addressed with a well-timed positive media cycle. The problem is architectural. The entire structure of Camilla's public legitimacy rests on the rehabilitation narrative. The rehabilitation narrative rests on the version of events in which Diana's removal from the center of royal life was a private marital tragedy, rather than an administered institutional process. Diana's letter, authenticated, registered, permanently preserved, describes an administered institutional process with specific legal mechanisms, specific administrative strategies, and a specific timeline. You cannot have both the rehabilitation narrative and the letter. They cannot coexist. One of them has to give. And the one with forensic authentication, physical documentation, a duplicate in a lead-lined vault, and permanent registration at the London High Court Probate Registry is not the rehabilitation narrative. William's position in all of this points toward what happens next. He is the future of the institution that his mother documented in her final weeks as an apparatus of administrative control. He is also the son who, in the immediate aftermath of the letter's release, chose his mother's documented truth over his father's communications strategy. The palace made a calculation 30 years ago that time and narrative management would eventually smooth over the ruptures of the 1990s. That calculation assumed the documentary evidence of those ruptures would remain contained. The mahogany box in the Northamptonshire Library just proved that calculation wrong, and the consequences of that proof are going to reverberate through the institution for years. Not as political crisis, not as constitutional emergency, but as something more persistent and more corrosive. A public that now knows the version of events they were sold for 30 years was manufactured, and a queen consort whose entire public identity was built on that manufactured version. Anne did what Diana asked. She showed up quietly. She walked with the boys through the park during school breaks. She kept her copy of the letter sealed with Diana's original wax stamp, reading it once, understanding the mission, and locking it away. Carrying the weight of its contents in her memory for 30 years without seeking credit, without selling the story, without even reopening the envelope. And when Charles Spencer came to her by private car with the authenticated original and told her his legal team believed the public interest required publication to correct the false historical record, she leaned on her roll-top desk and listened in complete silence and gave her quiet endorsement. Because she recognized that with the Althorpe copy fully authenticated, any attempt to hide the duplicate would look like exactly what it would be, a desperate palace cover-up. And she had spent 30 years protecting Diana's sons. She wasn't going to start protecting the palace's narrative management now. The mahogany box is empty. The letter is in the National Archive. And the question that the palace cannot answer publicly, but is asking privately, in every corridor and every communications meeting right now, is a simple one. How do you continue the rehabilitation of a queen consort when the woman that rehabilitation required erasing has just deposited the documented record of her erasure into the permanent public record? How do you promote state charity appearances and project warmth and stability and continuity when the front pages are carrying full-page replicas of a dead woman's handwriting and 90% of the public is expressing gratitude toward the person who protected that woman's children from the institution you represent? How do you manage the narrative when the narrative has already been permanently, legally, irrevocably superseded by the document it was designed to replace? Diana knew. She knew when she put on white gloves in the study at Kensington Palace and wrote to Anne with clinical precision about administrative traps and the 1772 Royal Marriages Act and the assembly of legal machinery against her. She knew she was running out of time. She knew the institutions she was fighting had resources and legal strategies she couldn't match in the open. So she didn't fight in the open. She documented, she preserved, she built redundancy into the architecture of her own record. She trusted Anne. And she left for the Mediterranean 3 weeks before the crash in Paris, with a deep sense of administrative anxiety and the knowledge that she had done everything she could to make sure the truth would survive her. It did survive her. It just took 30 years and a man in white cotton archivist gloves to bring it into the light. And now that it's in the light, no amount of communication strategy, no carefully choreographed state appearance, no frozen media campaign, no joint family statement can put it back in the box. The box is empty, and the truth is in the National Archive, and Camilla's future is being weighed against it every single day.